So the good news about animation in Cinema 4D is that introducing animation and getting content to animate in Cinema 4D is really simple. Um, and yet animation is a really complex topic, and the tools with which we can explore animation in Cinema 4D are very deep, very complex. So to get a simple motion to happen is really, really simple. To get really effective, complex motion can be pretty simple to kick off, but you could spend an entire semester just refining a simple animation. And so we're going to be very strategic about the way that we animate, and we're going to create some really wonderful animations over the course of the 16 weeks. But for today, what we're going to do is we're going to kick off just a really simple motion in animation, and just kind of create some shapes, have them move across stage, have them rotate, and do a couple of things, and just really experiment with getting content to move around. So in order to demonstrate this, I'm just going to create a simple cube. So I'm going to go up to where I can generate geometry, and I'll choose cube. And my goal is to establish a really simple motion from one position, and maybe here towards where my mouse is, and have it move across stage over the course of a couple of frames towards the back or the background. Okay. Now, in order to get this to happen, we're going to focus on the timeline. And if you look down here, just above the material manager, we have our timeline and our timeline tools. And the way that the timeline is laid out is that we have this green rectangle, and the green rectangle is our playhead, and that indicates our current point in time. By default, your playhead should be at 0, but you do have the ability to move this playhead back and forth in time. And by default, any Cinema 4D project comes with 90 frames of information, or 90 frames of time. Okay, we can add to and remove frames, but for this project, we're going to let it default. We'll talk a little bit later in detail about the relationship between the number of frames and frame rates and all the things that we want to keep in mind. But for now, all that we need to be concerned with is that by default, Cinema 4D is playing at a frame rate of 30 frames per second. So up to frame 30, that amount of information plays in 1 second of time. Okay, so with 90 frames of information, Cinema 4D has currently set to play for 3 seconds. So any animation that we create over the course of 90 frames will take 3 seconds to play, and that'll sort of be the standard for this class. Now, let me just give you a really quick tour of the timeline. The way that the timeline works, we've established that we have our frames here, and as we advance our playhead, we can look at the individual frames, and currently we don't have any animation, we don't have any change in time, and so therefore we don't see any results. Just underneath, we have this indicator of 0 frame, and on the other end, we have 90 frames, and that is our frame range. Our animation is currently set to start on frame 0 and go to frame 90. Okay, and that is represented here by the timeline. If I wanted more or less frames in this animation, all I simply have to do is key in the number of frames that I want and hit return. And you can see now that our timeline reflects frame 0 to frame 30. So our start and our end frame. So I'll change that back to 90 frames. You'll notice that when I change that back to 90 frames, I'm still only showing 30 frames in the timeline, but what happened is this little slider bar actually got compressed to show 30 frames of information. So what this slider does, by default, I'm going to click and drag one end of it. By default, this is what the view looks like. It's showing us a range of frame 0 all the way to frame 90 in our timeline here. If I compress this, this will show me a zoom view, and I'm looking at frame 0. So what this has done is allowed us to zoom in on the timeline, and we can drag this slider and position it at different points in time. So this is just giving us really a frame range to look at, and then we can slide it through time. So if this seems like an abstract concept to you, don't worry. You don't need to play with the frame slider yet. The key thing to focus on is the fact that you have a playhead, you have a start frame and an end frame, and those frames are represented in the timeline. We'll take a closer look at this power slider throughout the rest of the semester. Just to the right of the start and end frame and the slider are the different playhead controls. So we have rewind, or goes to the start of the animation. We have go to previous frame. We have play in reverse. We have play forward. And if I just click the play button, and I'll toggle that on and off, you can see that the playhead starts to advance through time. So I'll hit the play button, and it's showing me, it's approximating the frame rate and how fast this is going to play. Over here to the right of the timeline, you can see our current frame, and we can use that current frame for whatever reason. If we want to type in a frame number and hit return, our playhead will jump to that frame in time. We can advance forward one frame at a time, and we can jump to the end of time, or rewind back to the beginning of time. So those are just the playhead controls. To the right of that, these are our keyframe options, and this is really where all the magic happens. This will allow us to introduce keyframes which mark a point of change in time. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute, but the one thing that I want you to focus on is that first red button, there's a little symbol of a key on it. This is the button that we want to use for now. This is record keyframe. The other options are automatic keyframe recording, and this has to do with setting selections for a keyframe. So we're going to avoid the last two red buttons and really just focus on that record keyframe position. And I'll refer to that as marking a keyframe. To the right of that are a bunch of toggle buttons, and these are the parameters with which we're going to record, what parameters we're going to record with our keyframe. And I just want you to ignore these for now. Just avoid clicking on them because they are toggle buttons. And right now mine are showing up in blue, and if I click on one of them, I've just turned off that position marker. We want all of those turned on, the position, scale, rotation, and parameter. Those should all be turned on, and if you haven't clicked on one of those, they should be turned on at this point. And so it takes me a really long time to explain all the keys and options down here in the timeline. It only takes me about just a few seconds to show you how this all works. The way that what we're going to do is I want to establish a real simple animation, and I want to define my start position and my end position. The way that I'm going to do this, the recipe for the animation is that you want your playhead in the frame that you want to record the position of your object. And because I want my cube to start in the foreground and move to the background, I'm going to make sure that my playhead is on frame 0. I'm going to reposition my cube, and I'm going to mark the keyframe by clicking on this little red keyframe. Now once I do that, you'll notice there's a little tick that shows up, a little frame indicator that pops up in the timeline underneath the playhead. That's a keyframe. That is an indicator that we've just recorded the position of this cube at frame 0. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to advance the playhead to the last frame in the animation. I'm going to move the cube to its ending position. I'll just push that back in space, and I'll record the keyframe. And now I've just established a first keyframe and a last keyframe. Okay, and because I've recorded two different keyframes and a position change between the object in time, now when I scrub my playhead, I can see that a simple animation takes place. Or I can hit the rewind and hit play, and I have, in really simple terms, a very simple animation unfolding. Okay, so just to review that, I'm gonna delete everything that I have here and start over, and I'll do this in 30 seconds or less. I'm gonna select the cube. I'll hit the delete key, and that deletes the cube object and any animation that's been associated with it. I'm gonna create a new cube object. I'm going to reposition the cube to the start frame. Now I want to record that position at the beginning of time, so I need to make sure that my playhead is on the first frame with that cube in place, with the cube selected, with the playhead on frame 0. I'm going to record that first keyframe. The next step, and this is very important in the sequence, I need to advance my playhead to a different position in time. I can change the position of the cube, and I can record that keyframe. The minute I do that, I see an animation path pops up. We'll talk about that in further presentations, but I really have, at this point, the simple recipe for an animation. So I'll rewind, and I'll click play, and if you followed that procedure, in sequence, you should have a really simple animation unfolding inside Cinema 4D. So give that a shot. We'll catch up in the next presentation, and I'll reinforce some of these concepts.